Rogers, and welcome to Translating Your InfoPath Forms to PowerApps. I am a Microsoft MVP and I work at IW Mentor. I'm a SharePoint trainer, and this session has got so much to show you and so much to talk about that I'm just going to get right into it. Our agenda is going to be, we're going to talk about an intro about what this session is about, go into some form building concepts. I'm going to do a ton of different comparisons between the way we did things in InfoPath and translating that to how it's going to be done in PowerApps, and then we'll talk about, I'll do a demo of some specifics on how to do some of these things, and just in general as we go we'll talk about your next steps and how to start doing this yourself. Alright, so a little bit back to some of my background. I started using InfoPath back in when Office 2003 came out, so a really long time ago, like 14 years ago. So I loved InfoPath. I used it for years. I wrote the Microsoft Press book, InfoPath 2010, with SharePoint 2010 step by step, and I just absolutely did InfoPath all day, every day. Absolutely loved it. InfoPath is dead though. Microsoft has put a deadline. They said as of 2026 they will be no longer supported. InfoPath's an antiquated technology. It was really cool at the time, but it is not modern and is not compatible with a lot of modern browsers. It is just not the wave of the future. So although I did love InfoPath, I've stepped way away from it, and I'm also trying to encourage you all to do that as well. And Microsoft's new completely different product that I recommend that you go to if you want to use to do what's out of the box in SharePoint is PowerApps. It is only in the cloud, Office 365. It is not an on-premises product, so I just want to say that right off the bat. So here in this screenshot we have a picture of an InfoPath form and a picture of a PowerApp, and as I go through these comparisons, the example that I'm using is an absence request. So I've got an absence request form that I did in InfoPath with some pretty little repeating tables in it, and then an InfoPath form in PowerApps. And I'm going to show you all these very specific concepts and terminology that we used in InfoPath and translate it to how you would do that in PowerApps, so you will feel comfortable going forward after this session and kind of taking some baby steps to start creating new things in PowerApps going forward, and at least try not to create new things in InfoPath. That's my main goal for you, and hopefully you'll be able to start transitioning a lot of your InfoPath forms, recreating them as PowerApps between now and 2026. So, all right. First of all, step one. I say step one because this is the first thing, just easy way that we can customize a SharePoint list form in InfoPath is there's that pretty little button in the browser right there in the ribbon in a SharePoint list. This came out in SharePoint 2010. Click to customize an InfoPath. You just quickly make your tweaks to the form and then publish it, and you're done. And from then on, when people fill out the form, they are filling out the InfoPath form. Same way in PowerApps, when you're looking at a modern list in in SharePoint online, it has to have the modern look. So in the list advanced settings, go all the way to the bottom, it has to have that new look turned on, not the classic look. So when you have all that, you will have the PowerApps tab that says create an app, and then that will, similarly to the way InfoPath used to work, spins up your new app, and then it builds the whole thing for you. It builds all of your screens, it puts all the fields on the screens, and you're basically ready to publish and start using it and filling out the form that way. It's super simple, just like it was with InfoPath. And that's you get just an out-of-the-box, little app like that, just like you got a quick out-of-the-box one with InfoPath. All right, so the first thing you do, of course, like I said, step one was just clicking to generate that app. And that app that it generates for you is going to be very helpful, especially the first time when you first start doing these. because it will kind of teach you a lot of these concepts, because you'll be able to dig around in this generated app and see how some different things are done without having to start completely from a blank slate. Of course, when you get a little more advanced, you could just open up PowerApps and click New and just start with a completely blank Power App, and you could do it that way. So here's some concepts to talk about that we're going to go through in all the rest of the slides. We're going to talk about the data that's involved in your forms, this concept of a tree view. We'll talk about screens, galleries, forms, cards, and then buttons and navigation and how all that works. Okay, here's the tree view. In InfoPath, we had a tree view on the right. In PowerApps, we have a tree view on the left. In InfoPath, the tree view was really just the fields. So you had some little kind of groupings you could do in there to organize them, but it was just the fields. In PowerApps, you actually have not just the fields, these are actually the controls. So when you're looking at this tree view in PowerApps, you're looking at a list of every single control on your form, because we found that as we were creating PowerApps, we do kind of some layering every now and then, and or kind of some different logic to say, if this condition exists, then show or hide a particular field. Well, if your field was hidden, if the logic was turned to hidden, and you were in the middle of designing your form, it was actually kind of hard to get to that control to select it, to be able to just work in the form and design it. So when you're working with the tree view, this is very helpful to be able to specifically select things that you want to work with, like shapes and buttons and text boxes and labels and just whatever it happens to be, and just to be able to select them. It also helps as you're creating your Power App for you to name them something useful. All right, now we have a couple of concepts that are similar. We had views in InfoPath, just different ways of slicing and dicing and looking at the form, just different sort of pages of the form. And in PowerApps, we have screens. Same exact concept. Screens are just different parts of your app that you want to navigate the user to. Or, in InfoPath, sometimes we would have a new view, which is what people see when they're filling out a new form, and have a different view for maybe approvals, and have a different view for, later on after the form, like the status is completed, give people something different to see. In your app, you can actually have the users, clicking around in different forms. You could make them look like in different screens. You could make your buttons even look like different tabs and navigate them to different screens. So sky's the limit, but your screens have nothing to do with your data necessarily. It's just, you're just showing your data in different ways and organizing it in different fashions, showing forms versus lists of things on different screens. And notice in this little toggle button, you can toggle between screens and tree view on the left side in PowerApps. Here's an example of a few screens. We have a list of customers. When I click a particular customer, it takes me to another screen, which is a list of that customer's projects. Of course, this particular app is phone shaped, so it's phone size. It's sort of smaller size. You can have desktop size ones as well. And the third screen, when I want to fill in a timesheet, that's my time entry. And then the fourth screen is a list of all the time entries for that particular project that I could go edit one of those if I like. So those are, again, just different ways of presenting different data to the user and letting them navigate around between screens. You just, kind of remember as you're building this to be sure and put buttons for them to be able to get back where they were or get home, and kind of think through what that sort of flow is going to be as they move their way through your app. All right, so we have this concept of properties as well. In InfoPath, when you selected a particular control, you could right-click on it and go to properties, or you could see the properties in the ribbon and be able to edit some of the properties about that control from the ribbon. The same concept exists in PowerApps, except it's very different. So it's the same concept, but the properties are a lot different. They're a lot more detailed. Now there is a nice easy properties pane that exists in PowerApps that's got a nice simple user interface, but you also have what you see in this slide, this advanced view. So any control that I select, a button or a text box or a label or a drop down or a radio button, whatever I select, I have, like 40 different properties about that item that I can edit and alter from within the screen. Also, there is a properties drop-down box at the top of the screen. So it's two different places where you can kind of do the same thing. So you can pick a property from the drop-down box that you see here, and you can also pick a property if you go to the advanced pane on the right side of the screen. Just two different ways of doing the same thing. We also have the concept of rules in InfoPath and PowerApps. The sort of the way rules are done in PowerApps is pretty different. So when we get to rules, this is where you're really going to start to see some of a learning curve when you're learning this. Rules in InfoPath were fairly simple to understand. You say what you want to happen, basically, like when you click a button. You can define a few actions to happen in a row. It's a very succinct list of actions, like submit a form, set a field value, switch views. And you basically just say which actions you want to happen in a row. And you have your rules pane. That's in InfoPath. In PowerApps, they did just introduce a rules pane that I'll show you in a minute, but it doesn't work at all in the same way that the one in InfoPath did. So it's kind of a different concept to get your head around. Just something simple like submitting a form, like doing a couple of things that doesn't have a condition. Here, this is an example. So I have a save and finish button, and what do I want to happen when someone clicks it? So I have several different actions that exist. I have a few common ones that I can share with you, but I want the form to be submitted. You have to say which form you want to submit, because of course, think about it, your app could have multiple forms on it, right? You have to say which form you want it to be submitted, and then put a semicolon, and then say what action you want to happen next. So the semicolon is what delineates between different actions that will happen in a row when I click this button. Submit the form, and then navigate back to the project screen. The data that we're dealing with in PowerApps is drastically different than InfoPath. It's much improved. It's much better experience. InfoPath was pretty painful. You mostly were dealing with SharePoint data in InfoPath. Every now and then I'd see people, writing web services or doing custom development to pull in and do things with other data sources other than SharePoint. I'm not a developer. I never did anything complex like that. I really just worked with SharePoint lists and libraries. But in PowerApps, you have hundreds of different types of data that you can connect to. So you can see an example of a list of some of these services. I'll go ahead and go to the next slide. This is just a small subset, a list of some of the connections that I've created. Of course, I have SharePoint. That's a connection. But I also have other services like Buffer and Twitter and Facebook and Google Drive and Instagram, all these crazy things. I can do SQL databases, Common Data Service, on-premises data, your on-premises SharePoint. There are, again, over 100 different types of data. So when a user is using your app and filling out forms and looking at information and going screen to screen, they don't even have to know how complicated that was, how many different pieces of data are coming in or being, sent to all these different locations. But you could have, a pretty complex app using all these services and different connectors all in one app, and it still just look really simple and really slick to the end user and do a lot of pretty complex apps without having to write code. Now, when we get to some of these functions that you're writing in the properties and things like that in PowerApps and doing some logic, that's does get kind of complicated, but we're not having to write a programming language. Of course, if you are a programmer, you can go and create your own custom connectors. Like if a connector doesn't exist for some service you want to connect to, or some custom service that you have, or some custom app that you have, you can actually create your own. Our next concept is forms. Now, I didn't put a comparison screen from InfoPath to PowerApps on this one because, InfoPath pretty much is the form. But a form in PowerApps is actually a control. So as you saw on some of the other screens in the Power App, and I was showing maybe lists of things or other data, every single screen is in a form. So if you want to put a form in your Power Apps, you actually go to the Insert tab and you choose to insert a form. So that's why this is a sort of a separate concept in Power Apps. Once you insert your form, then you just type in where you want the data source to, what you want the data source to be for your form. And then it's a pretty user interface. It's pretty easy. As you can see here, I have a property for my form. So the form is selected. And I have a property for the form called data source. And my SharePoint list that I've already connected to in my app is called timesheet. And I simply type timesheet as my data source. And then I get this nice pretty screen, a little panel down the right that just lets me put checkboxes next to all the different fields that I want to be shown on my form. And then they just appear on the form. I can say how many columns. It's a really nice, really simple user interface what they've done with this. This has come a long way since about a year ago when Power Apps was fairly new. So I think you'll really like this. Especially think about those just typical business users who, you don't want them to have to do anything super complicated. This is a really nice touch for making things like this easy for them. Put the form on the page, check some boxes, and then you have a nice, pretty professional looking form. Within your form, there's another concept to understand that's actually very different from InfoPath because this concept doesn't really exist in InfoPath. You have cards in Power Apps. Whenever I check the boxes to, make a certain form show certain fields, each field, this sort of little chunk like customer name or customer status, each of those is automatically what's called a card. And the card is comprised of the asterisk that shows that it's required, the label that says the name of the field, and the actual text box or drop down, whatever the control is. For people to fill in for that field. So all those are in that card for that item, and the cards can be moved around and they kind of go around as a whole. So that's actually a really big improvement over InfoPath because in InfoPath, if you moved a text box, dragged it around the form, it didn't necessarily, it didn't automatically move the label that goes with the text box. So that got to be pretty clunky and time consuming to rearrange things. So this is a really, again, a nice touch that we have in Power Apps. Another thing that we have with cards is once you get to the point where you do need to do some more advanced logic, do some conditional formatting, do some sort of custom formulas having to do with your controls in your form, you do what's called you unlock your card. So you click on that card to select it and you go to the Advanced tab and you'll see a little lock icon to show that it's locked. So they're all going to be locked by default. And you go in and you unlock it. And then that is what's going to allow you to do things like maybe change something and make it be a different type of control other than a drop-down box, or put some conditional formatting, or like change what a label says, things like that. Anything that you want to tweak, you need to unlock the card. The controls that we have to pick from within our form are really pretty incredible, especially compared to InfoPath. So if you look at the screenshot on the left, you see the old-timey old-fashioned InfoPath controls that are kind of just old and cheesy looking at this point. PowerApps is sleek and modern, and it has a ton of different controls that, InfoPath couldn't even imagine, because this concept of mobile didn't even exist back when InfoPath was invented. But you have things that are going to be really easy to use to interact with filling out forms on a mobile phone. You have things like toggle buttons and sliders, which make it easy, like as touch controls. And you have the ability to interact with the phone's camera and the phone's video camera and audio to be able to capture things from the camera. So all these things can be interacting with, if you're on a Surface or if you're on a phone, something that actually has that hardware, then it's going to be easy to build apps that actually utilize that hardware. This is a fun topic. Okay, so here now we have the concept of good old-fashioned repeating tables in InfoPath, which have been the bane of my existence for 10 or 14 years, because it's always been very painful to build this concept of repeating tables. Now, form library forms, it was easy to just drop a repeating table in, fill out the form. But the data, with a form library form, the data is just buried in the repeating table, just in the form, just in the XML. There wasn't a nice, easy, out-of-the-box way to just say, hey, I want this other SharePoint list to be this sort of sub-form and have it, be able to fill it out as you're filling out the parent form. So that whole concept is very clunky and very messy to try and build in InfoPath. You know that story. It was just horrible. PowerApps, we can actually do it. It's possible. We can create a nice, slick app with a parent and a child relationship. As you can see here in the screenshot, I've got my absence request, which is the parent item. And then within the absence request, I can have multiple days that comprise that one parent absence request. And then, of course, this sample data I have in here I'm taking 8 hours of vacation 3 times on the same day. But what you could do is the employee that's filling out their vacation time and sick time, you could have multiple rows with maybe taking 4 hours of vacation and 4 hours of sick time on this day, and then I'm taking 8 hours of vacation the next day, and you'd be able to kind of mix them up and then submit that as one absence request form. And a parent item is the absence request. That is a SharePoint list, and all the child items, the absence states, that is another SharePoint list with a lookup relating it to the parent absence request list. It's a whole relational database concept, and it's all possible and easy in PowerApps, not clunky and messy and just painful like it was in InfoPath. All right, it's pretty exciting. Next concept that we have is conditional formatting. Here's a couple of examples. In InfoPath, we had formatting rules where you could say, according to this condition, you want to hide or show something or show something as a different color. And in PowerApps, you can do that, but that is, again, where it starts to get a little tricky and to get that learning curve goes up, because that's where we get into logic and writing functions. Now, a lot of these functions are going to be familiar to, if you know Excel, and if you know how to write an if statement in Excel, and if you understand conditional formatting in Excel, rules in Outlook, those kinds of concepts, then this will probably make sense to you and it'll be easy to pick up. Here's an example on the screen of sort of the concept of the way a conditional formatting would work. What you do is you go to the actual object that you want to be a different color under a different condition. You select that object, like maybe it's a label, and then you write and you go to the color property. So you're going to have like a color, text color, background color, border color. You're going to have a lot of different color properties for any given object. So you go to the color property, like the text color of that you want to be a different color, and you write an if statement in the actual color property. So, for example, if the value of this text box is greater than or equal to 0, then the color is black, otherwise the color is red. That is the same exact syntax as of an if statement in Excel, and so it's probably familiar to at least most of you, but that's the way that those are structured. I've got another slide for you about this. So they just recently released this concept of this rules pane, and I just recently wrote a blog post about it. So this rules pane's only been around for a couple of weeks. It's brand new. I think it's probably got some work. It still needs a little work, but it's trying really hard to be that sort of understandable sort of replacement for how rules were created in InfoPath. So you can select something like I did. I selected this box at the bottom of the form, my submit button, and you select your item that you want to apply the rule to. You go to the rules pane, create a rule. You have to have a condition though. So in InfoPath, when you created a rule where maybe you just wanted a few actions to happen, you didn't have a condition, you just, if you click the button, you want this, this, and this to happen, and you did those in the rules pane. Well, in PowerApps, the rules are really just for something that, only things that have a condition. So you, in this case, the condition is if the title field is not filled in, if it's blank, I want this box to be disabled so they can't click next. Because if they did, they'd get this big, ugly, red validation error, and it's just kind of, it's not pretty to look at, and it looks kind of messy, and it gives them this big, ugly, cryptic GUID. So, so I want them to not have that out-of-the-box error message when a required field hasn't been filled in and they try to submit a form. So this is what I did. I said if is blank, and I picked data card value 1. That is actually the out-of-the-box field name for that title box, because I didn't rename it because I was lazy. I probably should have just neatly renamed all of my fields. Kind of keep that in mind. If it's blank, then the display mode of this rectangle is going to be disabled. So that means that it's basically the button is disabled and you can't click on it. So that is, the interface is really interesting because when you start creating your rule, first you define your condition just by, typing this something equals something just in an easy little command box. But once you start creating what you want the action to be, it's actually kind of like recording it looks like you're recording a macro, like in Word or Excel. Remember those old macros that exist? Because it puts a little screen across the top, a little message across the top saying that you're now defining what you want the actions to be that happen under this condition. So then you do the thing that you want to happen, like you change the text box to red, or whatever your action needs to be, and then you just sort of click like you're done, sort of like stop recording the macro, and then it spits out a rule for you. So it's a pretty interesting interface, and takes a little getting used to, but at least it sort of lays it out over here now when you're looking at this rule pane, and explains what's happening after you've written the rule. All right, the concept of publishing in InfoPath, this was pretty painful. If you're just filling out, just publishing a form to one place, one library, making changes, publishing it back to the same library, that was always pretty simple. But whenever you had a situation where you needed to have maybe a draft version and not publish it, and be able to test it, or have publish your form to this farm and publish your form to the other farm, and then you end up with this big mess of sort of versions being confused and duplicate fields everywhere. You guys might have experienced that. That was very messy in InfoPath. With PowerApps, when it comes to publishing your form, you can actually work on it a good bit and be able to test it with that preview button. And then you can publish it when you're ready, and you're actually going to see a list, as you can see here, the list of versions. You're going to see a list of all of your versions and who edited them, because you can both, different people can take turns editing your Power App. And then when you publish it, notice the little purple button that says live. So as soon as you hit publish, then the word live is going to be next to that official published version of your app. And then I like the way that they put the PowerApps release next to this. So that's going to be helpful because as PowerApps itself gets updated, now this is going to help prevent it randomly breaking forms of yours that are in production. So if you have, things maybe that have changes that have come out in PowerApps that you do want to implement in your app, then you can republish it, go out of your way to republish it, and that would apply that new PowerApps release to it. But they had situations where PowerApps that were in production would every now and then randomly break because something had been updated in PowerApps itself that affected those apps. So this is good. So this is actually a good improvement, and you can collaborate with people, take turns editing it, and then be able to see this nice, neat list, and then you can go back and restore an old version if you like to. Alrighty, so I wanted to put this on a slide by itself. Get to know the formula bar. The formula bar is your new best friend. This is for those of you who are really going to be digging into this, and maybe you're advanced InfoPath users, Power users, and you want to start taking your old InfoPath forms and recreating them in PowerApps. Then this is where you're going to be doing all of your logic in the formula bar. And that's the little thing at the top of the screen. So here are some common actions that we use a lot when we're creating PowerApps. Navigate will take you from screen to screen. Submit form will submit, you have to have a form control, and submit form you have to say which form you're submitting, and it will submit the form to the data source like SharePoint. New form is going to pull up a new blank form. Edit form, of course, you can edit an existing one, and you can refresh, which means it refreshes the data itself. Like if your data, you're looking at a bunch of items in a SharePoint list, you can create a refresh button that refreshes the list. Update is going to update the data and then run a flow. It means that you can go create a flow, go to flow.microsoft.com. This is the new way of doing workflows, and create a flow, and you can actually create a button in your Power App that will trigger the flow. Pretty cool stuff, huh? All right, formatting and colors. This is pretty different. So I don't really have sort of an alternate way of doing this concept in InfoPath. In InfoPath is pretty much just you have the toolbar and you edit the colors just like you do in Word or something. And you can do that in PowerApps, but when you want to get into doing something more advanced like doing conditional formatting, that's when you're going to go to these actual properties, and especially like the color properties for conditional formatting, and be able to create those conditions in the color properties. Like again, for example, I could go to like border color here if I wanted to, and say if the value is greater than or equal to 0, the border is going to be black, otherwise it's going to be red. So that could be a nice indicator of, you can make it, look nice and pretty, and if something's required and it's empty, then you can put a red box around it. So you can pretty much, the sky's the limit for what you're going to be able to do with a lot of the way that your Power App is going to look. All right, let's do a demo. All right, I have this lovely expense report app. I can see all of my existing expense reports, and I can click new to fill out a new one. And as people are filling out a new expense report, this first thing that you see is really just the basic like parent form information. And for an expense report in this case, we didn't have that much. We just really have like, what are you calling your expense report? And then we're defaulting a couple of fields to information about the current logged in user. So trip to Ignite. And then this is where it's taking me to this whole parent-child relationship here where I have, okay, this is my trip to Ignite up here, but what are my detail items? What are the actual separate expenses that I had? I can go add an expense item. I can say, notice here that the parent ID is defaulting to that parent expense item. Now, normally in a form, I wouldn't have that showing. You wouldn't want the end user to see that or be able to change that, but I wanted to show that to you as I'm filling out this form to show this concept of having a relational database. All right, so now I've submitted that item and I can keep going and submit multiple child items. So now I've got also a total up here. I'll do another one real quick. Isn't that lovely? Now it's got my total up here in the parent item, and then I've got a couple of child items. You can see, again, the parent ID, that's not something end users care about. You normally show in a form, but I'm showing it here just to demonstrate this, that it's passing that parent information. All right, I can go in here and edit any of these. I can go in here and this is pretty cool, watch. Ooh. So I can go to a detail here and I can go edit it as well, if I need to go change something. So that was just a quick demo of my fun little sample app that I created, and now I'll go ahead and show you some of these concepts that we talked about in the slides. I've got my screens over here that toggles between that and my tree view. I've got, of course, my design surface here in the middle, and I've got a couple of different screens in my app that I can work on and toggle between. And then when I select different controls in my app, I can see which one that I've selected over here in this tree view. This is a gallery. This control here is a gallery. So a gallery is a way of working with a list of items. So this is a whole list of expense reports. We also have another type of control in here that's a data table, and that is also the same concept of having a list of items in your app. So those are mostly the same. I actually like galleries better because you can configure them more as far as the way they're shaped and the way they look and the way things are arranged in there. But let's see, I'll just go over a few of the concepts that we talked about. I mentioned the properties. So properties, I'll go ahead and go to one of my forms. So this is the concept of the form that we have. So this is the expense report detail form that people are going to be filling out. So again, I wanted to show you this concept of properties. So anything that I select in my form, I have this contextual list of properties. So you can see the properties change when I select the card versus selecting the drop-down box. And so this is a fairly new concept of making it nice and easy to understand what a lot of these are, like the size, the padding, the color of the text box versus the color of the fill. And it's all just, easy and makes sense. And you're probably wondering, well, okay, what's the big deal about that? Well, before we had this nice, pretty easy properties pane, we had this. So this pane over here, advanced, with all these colors and all this craziness and like 100 different fields, that is what we had before we had the nice pretty property pane. So this is really good. The properties pane is really good to have just for some simplicity, but if you really want to dig in and kind of see what's going on behind the scenes, or be able to go find something obscure and change the property, this is where you could go do it. Also, again, all these properties that are listed down the right in this advanced page panel are also the same ones that are listed here. So all of these are the exact same ones, just a different way of getting to it. For example, my data source is the expense items. I'll show you one little fun thing that I did. So we have on select, this button is going to submit the form. I actually put a rectangle that's clear on top of this whole section down here. And what this does is I put a whole clear rectangle on top of this, so basically so that the button is bigger. It's a bigger surface area to be able to click submit instead of just having to click on the little circle. And then let's go to the visible property. I'm doing a whole bunch of variables in here. So again, that's going to be for another session. I'm going to have a whole bunch of this out on my training site to teach you all kinds of more advanced and more intricate PowerApps training. But I'm using variables all over the place in here to toggle, hide, and show things so that we can have this sort of minimalist approach to having less screens and just having logic showing and hiding things. All right, so we went over the concept of the screens in the tree view, the concept of these contextual sort of properties where, depending on what you click, not only do you get different things that will show and hide in the ribbon, just like in all of your Office programs, but you'll also get different sort of properties that you can deal with over here and up here. And then if you want to make a button do an action, again, this is the contextual ribbon, so you can go up here and you have a couple of things that it lets you pick from. But again, this properties panel up here is where that's going to be your friend, because the properties panel is going to be really helpful in being able to go in here and write these functions for making your form do things. I encourage you to do one of those and dig in and really start getting familiar with the interface and get familiar with how some of these things are done in PowerApps so that you can start creating your own from scratch and start really just taking it and running with it. All right, thanks so much. I am Laura Rogers with IW Mentor SharePoint Training, and my blog is Wonder Laura. See you online.